a troubled country sliding deeper into crisis. This is what Kenya has become after an opposition-led boycott of presidential elections. Odinga's warning was aimed at his opponent, the incumbent president. Uhuru Kenyatta defeated Odinga in the original election back in August, but Odinga's NASA party successfully challenged the result in the country's Supreme Court. The court annulled the results and ordered a rerun on October the 26th. But the instability due to continued protests cut economic growth from 5.7% in 2016 to 2.3% so far this year, and the violence has claimed 51 lives since August. It's pretty much a clan war. President Kenyatta belongs to the country's largest Kikuyu tribe, while Odinga is from the Luo. Their rivalry goes back generations, but many believe it has no place in the present.
Let them come together and sit and discuss the future of our nation, because we want a Kenya where leaders come and go. We want a country where we can live for our children.
Despite the turmoil, neither side is willing to back down, and Odinga's party says it's certain to once again challenge the election results as Kenya's future continues to be uncertain. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
And to discuss Kenya's rerun election further, I'm joined now from Nairobi by Kimani Ichung'wah. He is a member of parliament for the Kikuyu constituency. Also from Nairobi, Dennis Owino. He is the founder of the news blog Kenya Insights. And from Johannesburg, Aisha Kaji. She is a political analyst and the former program director of the International Human Rights Program at the University of Witwatersrand. Thanks all so much for joining us. Is it fair, Aisha, as an analyst, I'm going to start with you, is it fair for the election board to declare a winner? Doesn't this just leave Kenyans exactly where they were before the Supreme Court made its landmark ruling?
Absolutely. It leaves Kenyans in the same position they were after the outcome of the August election, given that Mr. Odinga didn't participate in this election, and also given that many of the reforms that were recommended to be made before this rerun were not actually made, and that there are reports, widespread reports, of both electoral officials and judges and other members of the criminal justice system being intimidated in the run-up to this recount.
Okay, then let me ask Kimani. Do you think Aisha has made a fair assessment there?
You know, Aisha's assessment is very far from the reality on the ground. I can tell you there has been absolutely no intimidation on any member of the Electoral Commission or the judiciary for that matter. Number two, she talks about reforms that were recommended. And I want to tell Aisha there were no reforms that were recommended by the court. The court just made a simple ruling that there were illegalities and irregularities that was up to the Electoral Commission to fix. And they did stipulate what they had done to fix those problems. What she's calling recommendations were demands by one of the political parties that was supposed, Mr. Odinga's political party and the coalition he led. Reforms that they wanted to be done before they could go into elections. And many of those reforms were done. The ones that could not be done are those things that were absurd and practically impossible to do within the timelines that were there, the 60 days that were put by the Supreme Court. Therefore, what has happened is that we, as a country, have stood by the rule of law, we have stood by our constitution, and we are abiding, the IEBC, the Electoral Commission, is abiding by the ruling from the Supreme Court that they had to hold elections within 60 days in line with the constitution and our laws, our electoral laws. And I think that has been done. The fact that Mr. Odinga decided to boycott this election is a vindication of our position before, that he knew he was going to lose in this election, and he could not in any way garner the numbers that needed him to win in this election. And there's nothing that illegitimizes this election because Mr. Odinga decided to boycott. What would be illegitimate in this election is if we did not abide by our constitution and our electoral laws.
But Kimani, I mean,
Why then did an electoral...
Okay, go ahead, Aisha.
Sorry, why then did an electoral commission official flee to the United States just days before the election? Why were the reports that judges who were due to rule on whether the elections should go ahead were actually placed under house arrest, according to my sources on the ground, in Nairobi, in the run-up to the election? So if you say that this election hasn't been delegitimized, why is the major opposition leader, why has he boycotted this election? Why was the turnout so poor when Kenyans generally are very, very eager to vote in elections?
You know, Aisha, when you say that electoral officials had to get away to the United States, is only one commissioner, a commissioner who had her own issues because she was working for and with the opposition political party. She, you remember, Mr. Odinga before the elections did assert that he had very credible sources within the commission, and it's therefore clear who this commissioner or who these electoral officers were who are working with Mr. Odinga. And let me say it has been a very well choreographed attempt to sabotage the elections, right from the purported withdrawal of Mr. Odinga from the election without filling the requisite statutory forms, to the purported resignation and what was a stage-managed escape from this country by one of those commissioners who was working with them, was part of the wider scheme to try and derail these elections. The chair of the Election Commission was also being put under pressure by the same forces to scatter the election. Therefore, when Aisha also talks about judicial officers being put under house arrest, you know, it's absurd. Nobody from the Chief Justice to the 7 Supreme Court judges, every other Supreme Court judge who was not in court on Wednesday did give reasons. One of them is in hospital sick. He's been sick from the last court judgment. All the other judges some were out of the country. Remember the day that case was to come up on a public holiday. It was a public holiday.
Okay, Dennis, as a Raila Odinga supporter, I'd like to ask you what you make of the comments you've heard on both sides of this issue so far.
Well, as for Mr. Ichung'wah, I wasn't expecting any other thing other than defending the system. First of all, he's very economical with the truth. The fact that happened and everybody has been seeing is the judiciary has been under severe attack after the 1st September nullification of the election. And as everybody heard and as everybody seen, there was the government went on the extreme onslaught of the judiciary. And we've seen a lot of abuses, we've seen a lot of threats and intimidation of the court. And this came out in play the other day when the court lacked a quorum each to preside over, to hear the petition for stopping the election. And the MP was a bit economical with the truth in the sense that he was saying nothing happened. And in reality, a day to the petition hearing, we had the bodyguard to the Deputy Chief Justice who was shot, and this was a clear threat, a direct threat to the DCJ, and it played out the next day. We couldn't have a complete setup, so I think yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask, I mean, and I'll give Aisha, our political analyst, another take here. I mean, Aisha, there was so much enthusiasm and praise for Kenya's democracy when the Supreme Court overturned August presidential election result. I mean, did it serve for nothing if Kenya can't effectively hold a free and fair election that both sides accept?
Yes, I think it's going to affect not only perceptions of Kenya as a mature polity, a relatively mature polity in East Africa, but also it's going to affect business with Kenya. And of course, most tragically, it's going to affect ordinary Kenyans on the street, many of whom still live in dire economic situations, many of whom are divided along political and tribal lines, unfortunately. We saw that this kind of spillover from the political into the communal happened post the 2007 elections in Kenya. It was to be hoped that this could be avoided, particularly given that Kenya is one of the countries in the world that spends the most per capita on elections. So, given that it spends a large amount of money on elections, one was hoping that this rerun election would be free and fair, would be actually held along the lines that are internationally accepted around the world. However, because many of the inconsistencies, if you will, that were found with the August poll were not rectified. The issues within the IEBC were not rectified. That is why Mr. Odinga pulled out, and I would say legitimately so. So the perceptions of Kenya, both as a polity and its relations, its economic and political relations with the rest of the world, are going to suffer. And indeed, as I said, ordinary Kenyans on the ground are already suffering as a result.
Okay, Kimani, let me put this to you. In seeing that the body in charge of overseeing the election in the first round was basically deemed corrupt by the Supreme Court, which overturned their judgment, it still hasn't seen serious reform. And in this rerun election, we're getting numbers of around about 35% of registered voters actually taking part in Thursday's election. No ballots were cast in more than 20 constituencies. Can Uhuru Kenyatta have actual legitimacy if he continues to rule as president?
As I pointed out earlier, legitimacy stems from the constitutionality of the elections, and the elections were done in line with the Constitution and as ruled by the Supreme Court in their September 1st judgment that elections were to be held within 60 days. IEBC was a respondent in that petition, and they were ordered by the Supreme Court to conduct that election. It is instructive to also note that IEBC or any of its officials were not found culpable by the Supreme Court of any criminality or any illegality, none of the officers. And therefore, the demands by Mr. Odinga and his NASA coalition for us to act outside of the Constitution and outside of our laws, to eject from office electoral commissioners, electoral officials, to eject from office service providers who are providing the IT system, those who are to print ballot boxes. These are some of the impractical demands that Mr. Odinga was making on the Electoral Commission to derail the holding of an election. It is my assertion that Mr. Odinga and the NASA coalition were never interested in an election. Remember, before the August 8th election, they had filed over 100 cases before the courts, all designed to derail and sabotage the elections from happening. It therefore became impossible for them to go into a new election knowing the numbers would not in any way favor them. They were bound to suffer a humiliating defeat, and therefore went overdrive to try and sabotage that election from happening. Now the election has happened. What Mr. Odinga has done, he has transformed his political party from being what he called the National Super Alliance to what he has now called the National Resistance Militia. This militia is the militia that was in charge of making sure that a certain 9% of this country, 4 counties of what is Mr. Odinga's strongholds, did not turn out to vote. They also went out to intimidate using violence people in Nairobi and other areas not to turn out and vote. Therefore, Mr. Odinga and his militia cannot claim illegitimacy on the basis that people were not able to turn out and vote.
Okay, I will need to let Dennis respond. We're running quickly out of time. Dennis, go ahead.
First of all, I think the MP once again is pushing a lying narrative, a very poor crafted narrative, in the sense that just because the resistance movement that Odinga formed it for one purpose. He was saying that the system is installing anarchy. It is a movement to fight back against dictatorship that is now being installed again. So by profiling Odinga's supporters, calling them militia, it is a script that is now being advanced by the government to justify the police brutality that is going down in the Odinga's support base. And according to what he was talking about IBC, the commissioner who had resigned raised very serious issues as far as the credibility of the process is concerned, and also the chairman himself raised an issue. Mr. Kimani also said that the IBC officials were never intimidated. It's true. Everybody knows that we had the ICT manager who was murdered, and even the IBC commissioner Kombe herself also raised the same issues, and the same case was to the chairman and others. So it is very unfair for him to say.
Dennis Owino, I'm sorry, we're actually going to have to leave it there. We are completely out of time for this edition. I'd like to thank you all, three of you, so much for joining us there.